The Minimal Facts Method and the Fate of Jesus. Welcome. This is a spoken reflection on the minimal facts method for the resurrection of Jesus, drawn from careful historical study and set within the larger story of God's promise plan. The Christian faith rests on events that happened in real space and time, above all the bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. As 1 Corinthians chapter 15 makes plain, if Christ has not been raised, our faith is empty. Yet modern historical study often finds itself caught between two extremes, a strict naturalism that rules out divine action from the start, and a radical skepticism that doubts we can know anything certain about the past. Critical realism offers a way forward. It recognizes that every historian brings a personal horizon of assumptions, yet it insists that careful, transparent methods can still yield reliable knowledge of what happened. When evaluating unique events like the resurrection, historians turn to an argument to the best explanation. They test competing theories by how well each accounts for the established facts, how cleanly it explains them, how well it fits the first-century setting, how few unsupported assumptions it requires, and whether it sheds light on other historical puzzles. Gary Habermas has developed a bottom-up approach called the minimal facts method. Instead of first proving the general reliability or inspiration of the New Testament, it treats those writings simply as ancient source documents. It isolates a small core of data that meet two strict tests. Each fact rests on strong, multiple lines of independent evidence, and each is conceded by a wide range of scholars across the theological spectrum, from skeptics to believers. This approach builds like a bricklayer, not like a prefabricated roof. If one peripheral detail is challenged, the core structure still stands. It also avoids the double standard of accepting general reliability for ordinary ancient claims while rejecting it only when miracles appear. Even if we treat the New Testament texts the way classicists treat Homer's Iliad, as sources from which genuine historical facts can still be extracted, the bedrock remains. 6 minimal facts form the core. First, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. This is among the most secure facts of the ancient world, attested in Christian writings, by Josephus, by Tacitus, and by other non-Christian sources. Skeptical scholars themselves call the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate the most certain element of the tradition about Jesus. Second, the disciples experienced what they were convinced were appearances of the risen Jesus. The early creed preserved in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 3 through 8 lists appearances to Peter, the 12, more than 500 at once, James and Paul himself. Critical scholarship agrees this creed was already fixed within a few years, possibly months, of the crucifixion. The time gap is far too short for late legend. Third, those same disciples were radically transformed. They moved from fear and desertion to bold public proclamation, willing to suffer and die for their testimony. They were in a position to know whether they had actually seen the risen Lord or invented a story. Their sincerity is hard to dismiss. Fourth, the message was proclaimed publicly in Jerusalem itself, the city where Jesus had been executed and buried. An intact body nearby would have made such preaching nearly impossible. Fifth, James, the skeptical brother of Jesus, became a leader of the Jerusalem church after an appearance of the risen Lord and later died as a martyr. Sixth, Saul of Tarsus, a fierce persecutor of the church, was transformed into the Apostle Paul after what he described as an encounter with the risen Christ. Prior devotion, grief, or peer pressure cannot explain that change. The empty tomb stands as a closely related but slightly less universally conceded fact. It is supported by the embarrassing detail that women were the first witnesses and by the early Jewish counterclaim that the body had been stolen, implicitly conceding the tomb was empty. Even if an opponent sets the empty tomb aside, the 6 core facts remain. Naturalistic alternatives fail under the same historical criteria. The idea that Jesus merely swooned on the cross collapses against the medical reality of Roman crucifixion and the testimony that he was dead. The claim that the disciples stole the body and invented the story cannot explain their willingness to die for what they would have known was a lie, nor the conversions of James and Paul. Subjective hallucinations or grief visions fail to account for group appearances, physical details, and the sudden change in an enemy persecutor and a family skeptic who had no predisposition to see the risen Jesus. By contrast, the hypothesis that God raised Jesus bodily from the dead accounts for the full range of facts with greater scope and power, fits the first-century Jewish context, and requires fewer unsupported assumptions. Once the historical case is established, biblical theology can interpret its meaning. Walter Kaiser's Promise Plan theology traces a single progressive divine word of promise from Genesis through Revelation. It begins with the promise of the woman's seed who will crush the serpent, expands through the covenants with Abraham, Israel, and David, and reaches its historical center in the death and resurrection of the Messiah. The resurrection is not an abrupt interruption. It is the promised vindication of the obedient seed. Without a real historical resurrection, the promise plan would float free of the physical world God made and claimed. Read within the Second Temple's supernatural worldview recovered by scholars such as Michael Heiser, the resurrection is also Yahweh's decisive victory over the cosmic rebellions that began in Eden, continued with the Watchers, and culminated in the disinheritance of the nations at Babel. In raising Jesus, God broke the power of death, disarmed the rebellious powers, and began reclaiming the nations while keeping faith with ethnic Israel. The resurrection does not cancel the concrete promises to Israel. As Paul argues in Romans chapters 9 through 11, Gentile believers are grafted into the covenant root without replacing Israel. God's gifts and calling to ethnic Israel remain irrevocable. The risen Messiah heads one people of God, Jews and Gentiles together, while guaranteeing the future restoration of Israel within God's renewed creation. In short, the minimal facts method establishes the resurrection as a space-time event on firm historical ground. When that event is placed within the unified promise plan of Scripture and the Hebraic worldview of the first century, it stands as the climax of God's redemptive purpose, the defeat of cosmic rebellion, the vindication of the Messiah, the preservation of Israel's calling, and the opening of blessing to the nations. The historical bedrock does more than defend an isolated miracle. It anchors the entire story of Scripture in the real world God has acted to redeem.